Hello all, welcome to the fourth day and the final day of the conference. And we have two plenary sessions and two non-plenary sessions today. And the first plenary session will be, in the first plenary session, sorry for the trouble. So the first plenary of the day, we have Laura Marx Radek jointly presenting a paper, and we have Professor Soumya Brother Chowdhury from JNU, and we have Andrew Culp from Collabs USA, and Professor Geoff P. and Bradley will be chairing the session. And the final plenary will have Chunmei from Taiwan, and Nathan Wider from Royal Holloway, and Alex Take-Wangley from Tunghee. So let me just introduce the chair of the session, Professor Geoff P. and Bradley, who's a close friend, a comrade. He's a professor of English and philosophy in the Faculty and Graduate School of Foreign Languages at Teikyo University, Tokyo, Japan. He's visiting professor at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, India, and a visiting fellow at Kyunghee University, Seoul, South Korea. Geoff has co-written A Pedagogy of Cinema and co-edited Deleuze and Buddhism, Educational Ills and the Impossibility of Utopia, Educational Philosophy and New French Thought, Principles of Transversality, Bringing Forth the World, Bernard Stiegler and the Philosophy of Education. He's currently writing several volumes on schizoanalysis and the post-media, and published Thinking with Animation with Catherine Cheng in 2021. He's a scholar who works on the interface of Bernard Stiegler, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari, and one of the most important person in the field of post-media and schizoanalysis. Over to you, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Manoj. I'm blushing with those words. Okay. Well, I think whoever organized this panel is an absolute genius, because today we have three speakers and specialists in media and philosophy and art and theatre. So I think it's the plenary is going to gel really, really well. I'm really looking forward to it. I guess we'll have, I think it's 30 minutes each, and then we should have, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A and things like that. And as Manoj said, Laura Marx and Radek Przedpelski, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. I've been practicing, although. Radek is from Trinity College at Dublin, and they're going to go first and talk about a topic very close to my heart, which is on the Anthropocene and echo media. Just to give a little background, Laura works on media, art, and philosophy, and puts things together in a intercultural way. And she has 4 books to her name, and the most recent is Hanan al-Cinema, Affections for the Moving Image. And her unfolding aesthetics it says it's under contract with Duke University Press, so I'm looking forward to that. Laura is the co-founder of the Substantial Motion Research Network, and she's led the research group tackling the carbon footprint, streaming media, and she founded the Small File Media Festival. And she programs in experimental media art for places or venues around the world, and she teaches in the School for Contemporary Arts at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Radek Przedpelski lectures in Media Studies and Visual Culture in Trinity College, Dublin, and also at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. His work is in the interface of digital media and sound design, and he's what it says is a migrant artist working in sound photography and video. He was a postdoctoral research associate on the Tackling the Carbon Footprint of Streaming Media at Simon Fraser University, and presumably working with Laura. And he has published, I missed that. His book on, it's deleted for some reason, your book on Deleuze and multiplicity was published last year, which we're going to hopefully have a discussion on the GTCH channel in January. And he co-organized the TCD International Conferences on Deleuze, Guattari, and Aesthetics in the years 2016 and 18, and on art in the Anthropocene in 2019. So I'm going to pass over to both of you to begin your talk, and after that, we'll have the next speaker, and then the next, and then we'll take the questions at the end. So over to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jao, for that lovely introduction. And I really love this conference, even though I bitterly regret that I haven't been able to attend any sessions because of the schedule. But nonetheless, it's dear to my heart. And I'm greeting you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples in what is also known as Vancouver, Canada. And happy Saturday night. So I will speak first, and then Radek will speak. And then we'll show you, time permitting, we'll show you a couple of small file movies. Okay, I'm going to be talking about ensouled matter, the concept of the soul assemblage and soul assemblage media. But I want to begin first with some disturbing statistics. The data centers, networks, and devices that comprise information and communications technology are now calculated to consume as much as 7% of global electricity and are variously calculated to emit 3.3% to 3.8% of global greenhouse gases, which is more than the airline industry. And unchecked, ICT engineers have calculated that the carbon emissions resulting from ICT could exceed 7% of the 2016 level worldwide by 2030 and 14% by 2040. So we have a lot to worry about. And this is why I pulled together this research team of media scholars, which is Radek and me, and ICT engineers to survey the research. So this lovely diagram shows that although it's tempting for people to think of digital media as virtual, in fact, they create assemblages between media users watching on devices or larger screens with the infrastructure. And this infrastructure includes networks, both satellite and underground networks. It includes data centers, and it also includes production of devices, which you can see those people doing across the body of water, probably in China. And it includes mining for the metals that go into these devices, not to mention water and other uses. And one aspect of this electricity consumption I want to draw attention to is that our devices, phones, tablets, computers, use an enormous amount of electricity before they reach the consumer. With the case of mobile phones, it's calculated that about 90% of their energy consumption occurs when they're being produced. In short, the materiality of streaming media infrastructure shows that all kinds of life are bound up with our devices, data centers, and networks. And indeed, I'll argue they constitute a soul assemblage. So last year, I founded the Small File Media Festival to draw attention to this issue of the carbon footprint of streaming media and of information and communications technologies overall. And we decided that we would invite filmmakers to submit movies of no larger than 5 megabytes in size and 5 minutes in length. And makers rose to the challenge and submitted beautiful and inspiring movies. And at the end of our presentation, I hope that we will have time to show you a couple of these little gems. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing now and just talk. So now I'm going to argue that almost anything has a soul. Oh, and by the way, Joff or Manoj, would you please let me know when I've reached 13 minutes from when I began? Is that a yes?
That's 30 minutes. 30.
13.
13.
Yes, because Radek will take another 15 and then we'll show some movies.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Almost everything has a soul. So I start with the question, what is alive? Anything that feels, acts, or communicates. And to do so, it needs to have some kind of internal consistency, some provisional boundedness. A living being is a temporary fold in the cosmos that brings together a point of view. Enjoying the new technology of microscopy, Leibniz perceived the universe as packed tight with nested souls, writing, "Each portion of matter may be conceived like a garden full of plants and like a pond full of fishes, which in turn contain more gardens and more ponds. Ensouled matter is everywhere, and souls recombine into larger, more fleeting souls." And as you know, Deleuze easily broadened this life to incorporate non-organic life, um, saying that if life has a soul, it is because it perceives, distinguishes, or discriminates. So in the common division between organic and non-organic, life is thought to be an attribute of organs. In the biosemiotics of Jesper Hoffmeyer, what is alive is defined as something that is bounded by a membrane, which makes it capable to make signs, specifically to act as a Persian interpretant, as for example, when a cell interprets and responds to the electrochemical information that passes through its cell walls. But I would like to propose that the boundedness of non-organic beings, whether they're rocks or molecules or other things, lies not in membranes but in processes that bind them internally for some period of time. And it's the same, I argue, for the results of human processes, such as a crowd or a book or a city. Even things that don't do anything still have experience. As a chip of stone packed side by side with others in the pavement experiences their pressure upon it, the passage of air and water, the changes in temperature, and registers these as changes to itself. Passion, then, feeling while being unable to act, is a soulful way to be. So you don't need to be bounded by a membrane to touch or be touched. You just need to be held together provisionally by a process. To my thinking, that makes you a soul held together by a body. You are an assemblage of things that come together to feel, act, and communicate, to touch and be touched. You are ensouled matter. The assemblage of disparate souls produces a provisional collective skin, and that membrane has a very special tensile strength. Reducing its dimensions by one, Deleuze and Guattari call the shifting boundary of a multiplicity of fiber stretching in from humans and animals to molecules, particles, and imperceptibles, and out to the universe. So each entity is doubly connected to the cosmos, inwardly through its soul and outwardly through its skin. So you can still hear the echo of Leibniz here. What I call the soul assemblage is Leibniz's concept of the dominated monad turned inside out. Deleuze notes, a monad has as its property other monads, such as a cell, other cells, or an atom and other atoms. These are phenomena of subjugation, of domination, of appropriation that are filling up the domain of having. And this latter area is always located under a certain power. And we can connect this critique to the fact that Leibniz was writing during a time when Europe was enriching itself from the transatlantic slave trade, which is a very large iteration of the dominated monad. The knowledge that one's life is predicated on other dominated lives, or we could say populated by them, makes it harder to say, I have a body, I have a plantation, or I have an idea. Predication itself, the logical and grammatical presumption that predicates belong to a subject, comes into question. Everything that makes us what we are, everything we have, comes from outside us and is only temporarily enclosed within our membrane. Turning the concept of the dominated monad inside out, we can willfully engender soul assemblages, collectives, enclosing ourselves in a common fold. Any coalition of human, organic, and non-organic others is a soul assemblage. And forming soul assemblages can be an activist manner of unfolding. So each monad, whether within the soul assemblage or an individual soul, each monad remains a microcosm. It retains the shape of the cosmos, holding the infinite at its heart. The territory takes the fantastical shape of an infinitely inflected soul. Soul assemblages disperse and reassemble, yet maintain consistency, their constituents ever modulating. Soul assemblages chew up the scenery, deterritorializing systems that inhibit their thriving and establishing new territories. The Small File Media Festival is a soul assemblage that draws together filmmakers, environmental activists, electrons, broadband networks, video compression algorithms, tripods, social media, and many other entities into a common fold. Sometimes a soul assemblage extends its boundary to encompass something unfathomably distant. Children travel in their imaginations, creating worlds that support the self they want to become. Afrofuturist and indigenous futurist works often draw in distant stars, planets, and galaxies. In some other research that I do, talismans enfold a little piece of some faraway space and time and make it small enough that you can wear it on your body. These are the kinds of territories that Deleuze and Guattari note have an intense center that is located outside the territory, at the point of convergence of very different and very distant territories. Creatures may suddenly abandon all previous assemblages, collectively lurch out of their usual migration patterns, take off from the territory, and arrive on a cosmic plane.
Laura, I'm very sorry to cut in there, but you've been speaking for 13 minutes. So
okay, thank you. Oh, I haven't got to soul assemblage media. Okay, so I'm going to turn off. I'm going to stop reading and just oh no, yeah. Okay, I'm just going to tell you in in these 2 minutes that I've kept aside, that we can also think of media as soul assemblages, and we can think of how they may create healthy or unhealthy assemblages with the planet. Now, digital media, as I've already pointed out, make a number of unsalubrious connections with metals, mining, exploited workers, and an unsustainable greenhouse gas footprint. However, there are, and the majority of digital media occupy this kind of unhealthy soul assemblage. But I would like to argue that the tiny 5 megabyte movies of the Small File Media Festival are salubrious soul assemblages because they collaborate with electrons, they acknowledge ICT infrastructure but make small demands on it, and reflect the cosmos in both their soul and their materiality in a salubrious way. So I will stop there. Radek, how about I show one movie before you talk?
Sure. Yeah, please go ahead.
Shall I show? I'll show Magical Car Track. That's pretty cosmic.
Sure.
Okay. This is Magical Car Track by Tamara Bilankov from Croatia.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was beautiful. Okay, let me share my presentation. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to continue talking about Small File Media Festival, and hopefully, time permitting, I'm going to be able also to play some movies. And I'm also going to talk about this notion of cosmotechnical phylum, which is kind of my intervention into both Yuk Hui's notion of cosmotechnics and Deleuze-Guattarian notion of machinic phylum, as so far as it relates to this project of Small File Media Festival. But first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for organizers. Thank you, Manoj. I'm really honored to be here. I was really honored to be part of the Mumbai conference, and it was really amazing experience, and it's been a wonderful conference so far. I attended I'd say most of the panels, and they were all great. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to talk about Small File Media Festival.
So this is so I'm going to show a little presentation. So first of all, Laura was talking about this question of carbon footprint of streaming media, which is really creates this big environmental problem. And the question for Laura and I as media philosophers was what can we do to reduce the carbon footprint of streaming media in our capacity? Of course, the answer was the Small File Media Festival that was founded by Laura back in 2020. But at the same time, one of the inspirations for one of the things that really resonate with the festival is this really interesting project which comes from ICT computing, which is called Computing Within Limits. And this is a call formulated by a number of concerned ICT scholars who were pointing to this problem of unsustainability of ICT infrastructure, of ICT research. And those scholars, including Bonnie Nardi and other scholars, pointed out that computing research is actually predicated on a specific vision of the future that entails an ever-increasing production and consumption while ignoring the material impact of technology and planetary limits. So in response, they propose a framework of computing within limits grounded upon three key principles that are question growth, consider models of scarcity, and reduce energy and material consumption. So now, with the festival, we were also resonating with those ideas and trying to think how those principles can be implemented at the level of artistic and cultural production. Now, this notion of this ICT research and ICT technology predicated on a specific vision of unilateral growth, this is also something that resonates with the framework of Yu Hui, who says that this technology that we have right now, it's this unilateral vision of technology that goes back to Heidegger's notion of technology as enframing, Gestell. And this situation obscured the techno diversity that we have now, which is predicated on different cosmologies, which of course really resonates with Laura's concept of soul assemblages, because it grounds those movies from across the world also in different cosmologies that are irreducibly material. So coming back to the festival, Laura founded the festival back in 2020 as a way to question precisely this vision of a universal future based on the idea of unsustainable growth. We, as Laura already mentioned, we invited media makers to submit movies that would be of no more than 5 megabytes in size and no more than 5 minutes in duration. And this is really interesting type of proposal that resonates with computing within limits, but also more on an ontological level. It introduces in irreducible constraints as, let's say, we can say in Simondonian terms, as this condition of individuation. Perhaps we can go back to this later on. But coming back to the festival, over 10 days in August 2020, and also this year, we screened over 100 works by artists in 16 countries and in 10 different curated programs to 165 attendees. And this year, our festival was accompanied by panel discussions. Those panel discussions were really interesting because the idea was to engage different constituencies interested in the notion of small file media. So we had two panels that was wrapped around those communities of small file media makers. But and we also had a more media philosophical panel about cosmology, and also Laura had a panel also about aesthetics. But what's also really important, we also had a panel with ICT engineers that talked about the question of carbon footprint of streaming media from a really robustly materialistic and science-based realm of ICT engineering. So this was really important because for us, it was not only what the small file is already, but what it can do. So paraphrasing Deleuze, we also wanted to create those lines of light that would activate different communities and they to create people yet to come, so to speak. So the idea is for us to create further spin-offs of the festival, to activate different communities in different countries. Now our idea was to affirm this sustainability and this thinking through constraint on a number of different levels. So one way of thinking through constraint was this our particular brief. This year it was 5 megs of fun, 22 megabytes of trouble. Now the 22 megabytes of trouble was our recognition that binge watching is also really popular phenomenon. So we wanted to invite the artists to send us a series of works between 3 and 5 parts. And this is our response to, those large TV series. This is our small file response. Okay, and the documentation of the festival was compressed to small files before sharing on video. Through its constraint brief, careful programming, accompanying events, and overall commitment to sustainable green media, we have put forward a mode of critical making designed to change the habitual appetite for high-definition video as reflected in the Gibbons paradox. More efficient technologies encourage more use. And this, I'd say, also resonates with the Deleuze's cinema project, because the gist of this project is to disrupt the sensory motor cliches that are confluent with cinema as this material presence. So as a festival, we are inserting this interval or noise, between the habitual reactions that are framed by capitalist societies. Okay, and our small file movies are also cosmological in the sense that they ponder the mystery at the level of the pixel of how an extreme compression of time-space can nonetheless engender new vast universes. And by the same token, these small movies show how we can make do with less in the context of anthropogenic environmental degradation, proposing a visually appealing alternative to high-resolution representational images. Small file media index an era when we've learned that invisible dark matter and dark energy comprise the bulk of the universe, with visible matter accounting for only 5%. With the Earth itself, while the Earth itself is crisscrossed by the invisible filaments of data networks and pandemic viral circulation. So,
Radek, sorry to disturb you, but could you begin to finish off? Because
okay, brilliant. So one thing that I wanted to point attention to is that as part of the festival, we are drawing attention to a number of different solutions, practical solutions for filmmakers, how to achieve sustainability in their practice. So on our website, we list technical solutions and aesthetic solutions as well. Now, technical solutions, that would be solutions to do with transcoding, working within compression aesthetics, but we are also suggesting that technical solutions are also immediately aesthetic solutions. So this is also this idea of technology that it's not separated from artisanal and technical activity. Okay, so I don't think I managed to show any video, but perhaps we'll be able to do this later on. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll be really happy to answer any questions about the Small File Media Festival. So yeah, thank you. And I forgot, I did not have time to talk about cosmotechnical phylum, but if there are any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for both of you for that. We could. It's absolutely fascinating to have an idea about salubrious ensouled assemblages and matter, and the question of chaos. The chaosmosis technical, is that right, Radek? Is that?
Yeah, cosmotechnical phylum. Yeah.
Well, right. Well, maybe we can have a look at that in the Q&A. So, people listening, do put your questions into the chat box as we go through. Thanks for that, both of you. So I'm going to move on now to Sumimya Braha Chowdhury, who's a very, very famous gentleman in India and indeed across the planet. And he's connected with the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And he has a huge portfolio of expertise across the theatre, histories and performance theory and cultural studies and philosophy and politics, and I'm sure many more. And just to give some direction to his books, he has a book, Theatre, Number and Event, 3 studies on the relationship of sovereignty, power and truth, Ambedkar and the Immortals, an untouchable research program. And now it's come to distances. These are notes on the Shaheen Bagh and coronavirus association and isolation. And he has published a huge array of articles coming from ancient Greek liturgy and the staging of Ibsen and psychoanalysis, Nietzsche, Schiller and Hegel, which is quite phenomenal. And he has directed various theatrical productions as well. So without further ado, sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also, Bobby and Manoj, thanks for this very kind invitation. I regret not being able to attend much of the conference. Almost all of it I miss, which is my loss entirely. But I have read the list of speakers and themes, and that is scintillating. And so I will thank you and apologize for mostly not being there. So I have a title to this presentation, which I will come back to, and I'll probably also speak against my title a little bit, but also try to restore to the title its true amplitude. The title, I'll just mention the title so that when I come back to it towards the end, it'll make some sense. The title is Life, Body, Truth, a comparative note and affirmation in Deleuze and Badiou in times of crisis, in a time of crisis. That's the way the title is really printed in the brochure, in the booklet. So I'll come back to that. But before I make my main points, I'd like to begin with I'll relate to a little story. In a recent interview, Ariel Dorfman, the well-known Chilean playwright, when he was asked whether he truly believed that the good in human beings will overcome and exceed all the terrible things that human history is awash with, whether he's sure that the good in human beings will prevail, he answered that he's not sure at all. But he would like to wager on that event, that the good in humans will prevail. In the same way that lovers, they're not sure at all that whether their love will find a place in the world, but they wager their everything on their love. And so he ends that answer by saying, never bet against lovers. Now, what is going on there? It seems to me that that's an affirmation. That is an affirmation par excellence. But it's not simply an affirmation, it's an affirmation of an affirmation. Is the writers, the philosophers, affirmation of the lover's affirmation. So to me, that is really what is at stake. Not so much affirmation as the affirmation of affirmations. And what is the concrete situation or the conditions under which such affirmations are possible, and which are the conditions that actually block affirmation, or at least produce a certain kind of constraint that almost makes affirmation impossible. This is what I call crisis. So it is based on these parameters that I'd like to speak a little bit today. It seems to me that we can think of at least three kinds of affirmations that can be made by a philosopher. In the largest sense of the word, insofar as the philosopher is someone who speaks, because affirmation is also a form of enunciation, who affirms from a certain position of privilege, which is also what Hegel called the privilege of the evening. So in that sense, it's a useless privilege. When everything is over, philosophy comes into the picture. The famous Owl of Minerva image at the end in phenomenology. But it's also a privileged moment because it is from that moment that the philosopher is able to, in a sense, both affirm and reject the entire world as it has unfolded. So in that sense, the philosopher occupies a threshold in temporality between past and the present, but the philosopher also divides the present between what the philosopher affirms and negates. So in that kind of a structure of temporality, it seems to me that there are at least three ways in which we can think of a philosophical affirmation. The first is an affirmation which comes at the limits of a philosophical critique or a critique of knowledge. So for instance, with Immanuel Kant, what you'll find is an extraordinary system of limitations. So even if you take the first critique as an example, then what you'll find is that it is an extraordinary systematization of everything that constrains us, everything which restricts us in terms of faculties, in terms of what is strictly speaking powers. Faculty is not simply a faculty, it's a power. The constraints that are placed on our powers to know. And at the same time, there is an affirmation, but it is an affirmation at the threshold of those limits, which in the first critique is also called transcendental, and which is also called a kind of regulative idea. It's got an idea which can also veer or fall into illusion. So in that sense, it is a kind of ambiguous affirmation, which always comes at the end of a system. That's the first kind of affirmation that we can think of. But there's another kind of affirmation which actually comes from the paradigmatic philosopher, who is not a philosopher purely, but a theologian philosopher, in which we see affirmations which begin with a kind of position, with a kind of with a kind of fidelity, a kind of subjectivity, where the philosopher is already identified to be, say, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Muslim. And in that sense, the philosopher affirms something which is not a philosophical thesis at all, but a kind of position in life, position in the world. But at the same time, the philosopher comes back to this affirmation through the entire philosophical system or exploration or discourse that he or she creates in relation to the philosophical themes, which by and large are comparative and have a certain universalist amplitude between different religions, between different systems of thought. But here, the affirmation is, and that's why the affirmation is strictly speaking dogmatic, insofar as dogma is an enunciation which is affirmed at the beginning. But there is also, it seems to me, a third kind of affirmation, which is the one that I'd like to briefly take up today in relation to these two protagonists, Deleuze and Badiou, which I will call the philosopher's affirmation in the middle of things, where the philosopher is actually placed in history. And in that sense, the philosopher is someone who is challenged to intervene in the present, where something happens, a kind of event, to which the philosopher must respond with either, again, a certain kind of defamiliarization, or a certain kind of negation, or a certain kind of wager or gamble. And what is that gamble? You could call it the gamble of the name. In that sense, the philosopher makes an affirmation which is admittedly nominal, but that nominalism is itself something which has consequences. So in that sense, the philosopher is someone who names in the present something that is happening. Insofar as the philosopher does it, he or she also breaks the present between a certain continuity from the past moving to the future and a certain kind of incommensuration, a kind of inconsistency in the present. So we have a problem now in the present, which is a problem of something like a inconsistency, a kind of rupture. And the philosopher actually produces that rupture by the name. So one of the, I think, paradigmatic examples of that in modern philosophy is something that Deleuze though Deleuze is not usually considered to be the philosopher of the ruptural event, Badiou is. Nevertheless, Deleuze is actually an excellent example of illustrating the problem of affirmation in the present, which breaks the present. In a text which is very dense, condensed, and difficult text, which I come back to again and again, from 1967, that Deleuze spoke at a seminar, Society of Philosophy in France, called Method of Dramatization, which is also kind of condensed essence of his book, Difference in Repetition, which came out after that, towards the end of a fascinating discussion that he had with several other philosophers and also epistemologists and others. Deleuze to a question posed by the philosopher, well-known philosopher at that time, Philolenko, on Deleuze's relationship to post-Kantian philosophy, like Maimon, but also Leibniz before Kant. Deleuze makes a very, very precise, though a little brusque comment. And he says, you see, the thing is that we cannot read Leibniz, Maimon, or any of these philosophers without Freud anymore. So anything that you speak of in Leibniz, for instance, the monad, or in Maimon, which is something like the real as belonging to the domain of the illusion, he says all of this, or something indeterminate, the real is indeterminate. He says all of this has to be now, in the present, be referred to an affirmation of Freud, which means the Freudian unconscious. So there can be no Leibnizian unconscious or Maimonian unconscious or any other unconscious without affirming the Freudian unconscious. But this is not the same thing as the affirmation of love. This is not the same thing as the affirmation of, a certain political event. This is the affirmation of knowledge. But a knowledge which itself is not separable from a new name. And at the same time, what the interesting point here is that the new name is an old name, which is the unconscious. The name unconscious surely existed before Freud. And yet, there is within the old name unconscious, there is already a certain rupture within that name, which is indiscernible, but at the same time, which has consequences. And this is what Deleuze is affirming. Deleuze is again not known to be a philosopher of consequences, but a philosopher of the pure event. But actually, if you read Deleuze, then you find that Deleuze is extremely vigilant towards the consequences of philosophical events, which are not necessarily events created by philosophers. Freud is arguably not a philosopher. So this is in the middle of things. This is an affirmation in the middle of things. An affirmation in history, in that sense, the history of knowledge. But what this also shows, particularly from a philosophical point of view, is that the philosopher's main object, which is a kind of totality, which is kind of all that is, going back to the Greeks, all that is, has always, insofar as there is philosophical affirmation, what Badiou, in a very interesting article or also chapter in his book Logics of Worlds, or with regard to Deleuze, calls the outside. There's always an outside of philosophy, the philosophical totality. And there is no affirmation without the affirmation of this outside. We cannot go into the genealogy of this question, but in Badiou's article or chapter, he mentions a specific text, which is a text worth going back to, by Jean-Paul Sartre, which is called Transcendence of the Ego. But for the first time, we see that there is, in the very notion of something like consciousness, actually something impersonal, something outside, rather than it being an interior phenomenon or an interior reality. So in that sense, what is the outside which is produced in the middle of history? So in that sense, Freudian unconscious is the outside to philosophy. But it's not an outside which is a forever outside, a permanent outside. It's an outside which produces that break in the present, a kind of incommensuration, a kind of inconsistency. And to that extent, it is analogous to love, because love is always outside. Love is also a little bit of indifference to the totality of all that is. So in that sense, the Freudian unconscious is not simply jumping into a debate of knowledge. There's an ontological indifference to something new, even in knowledge, which is not simply knowledge, but which is also something which Badiou calls truth, which produces a kind of inconsistency, a moment of a certain gap in knowledge, a hole in knowledge. So the stakes of truth are brought in, not at the same level as knowledge, but something which is brought in as a particular kind of outside, the possibility of an outside to all that is. Now, it is in this framework that we have to go back to history and quickly probably consult our own times, the immediate times, the last 2-3 years, 2 years, for instance, and ask ourselves that what is a crisis then? If the general proposition is that the exception, or the outside is a kind of exception to what there is. And what we find with the notion of a crisis is that the crisis, particularly a crisis which gets the name, and the name reveals everything that is concealed there, which is a pandemic, which means something which is, and it's a metaphor I'm borrowing from the last speaker, set of speakers. It's like a collective skin, a world skin. Pandemic is a kind of world skin, but here the skin is obviously the skin is a threatened skin. That particular world, the world scale of the pandemic, immediately produces a peculiar paradox, which is that we are now in the middle of a total exception. Everything is an exception. So in that sense, if everything is an exception, or we are in the middle of a total exception, then surely the crisis is a crisis of the outside. There is no outside to this exception. Or that is at least the feeling. That is what we fear. That is what we suspect, that there is no outside to the pandemic, because the pandemic has taken us completely outside of how we are used to live our lives. So this is what subjectively one responds to when one is in the middle of a crisis. But we have to investigate this question. That is my first concrete point of inquiry, that we have to investigate the question of crisis. We cannot either bypass it and just go back to our usual habits, philosophical habits, nor can we take the crisis as a crisis at face value. We have to investigate this crisis. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to do it here in this brief duration, but what I will do is to mention my own, over the last 2 years, my own, my reading of the literature that has been produced in this crisis, vis-a-vis the investigation into this crisis. And for every investigation, methodologically, we know, scientifically, we also need a certain intelligibility, terms of intelligibility of a crisis, even if the crisis is so overwhelming. Now, of course, there are technical responses to this, but what I found in terms of the sheer scale of investigation in the literature that is produced, in the recent philosophical literature, at least in the recent time, is, for example, surely there are other examples, but for as an example, the remarkable set of investigations that the Crisis and Critique, Frank Gruda and Angus Hamza, their edited work brought out recently, where we find that a certain kind of Marxism, at least a certain kind of Marxism, is interested in investigating this crisis in terms of the parameters through which we evaluate it, instead of either being completely overwhelmed by it or by trying to bypass it completely, that, oh, this is, however bad this might be, this is just temporary. There are more profound, fundamental things in the world. You do neither. You actually investigate it at the level of the crisis itself. Now, one of the things that comes out out of these investigations, and they are not the same, there's a whole range of articles there, is that the crisis pertains and can only pertain not to a crisis in general, not even to a crisis of being, but crisis is always a crisis of organization. So insofar as life is the name of an organization, a kind of organismic organization, it is a crisis of that organization. Insofar as the world is an is the name of organizations, historical organizations, including economic organizations, there is a crisis of organization. And in that sense, what in a particular, just an example again, in a particular set of investigations made by the Circle of Ideas and Ideologies, which has, among others, Gabriel Tupinamba, the Brazilian psychoanalytical thinker, what you find is a very complex project of intervening in the crisis to produce its intelligibility in terms of organization. And the affirmative side to that project is to find, to this kind of a total crisis of the world as organization, the route or the passageway to what could be called exceptional organizations. So this is the most interesting part of this project, that is there at the level of organization, the exception to the organization, which itself is not organization, but something like organization thought of as exceptional to the very norm of the exception, a kind of material organization, new material organizations. So, for instance, one of the possible, well, I'm not saying that this is something proven or demonstrated, is it possible to think of the whole climate crisis today as a challenge, not only of the science of climate, not only as an ethics of life, but also as a question of alternative organization, which is already on its way, even if in an extremely nascent manner. So in that sense, the question of an exceptional organization, which arises not in commensuration with the present exception, or the crisis as a crisis for organizations, where everything has become an exception, but as something which challenges this very notion of the total exception. In that sense, an organizational affirmation. Now, this is by and large the background in which my own interest in the question of affirmation arises in the present moment of crisis, surely crisis. Now, obviously, I do not have the time to go into the details of this, but it seems to me that to enter this terrain, one has to not perform a kind of genealogy of crisis or even a genealogy of organization, but in a sense, following Badiou, in one of his interventions in Logics of Words, take up the question of organization at the level of what he calls, and this is something he has been doing since his early work, Theory of the Subject, which is to speak of not objective organizations, like, for instance, the names of political organizations, economic organizations, even the names of species as organizations, but what could be called subjective organizations. Is it possible to produce a thinking on subjective organizations which arise at the very conjuncture of disorientation, which a crisis produces? So not the obvious correlate of a disorientation, which is a disorganization, or the destruction of organizations, but rather an organization of disorientation itself, an organization at the level of disorientation. So in a sense, the challenge of climate today is a kind of organization at the level of disorientation itself. So that is not Badiou's example. So that is something which, on the one hand, is a paradigm of thinking for the future. But at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, and I'd like to, I don't know how much time, let me just quickly see. Probably.
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, not bad. So with these 5 minutes, I'd like to go back to two fundamental constitutive concepts that actually are not separate from the question of organization, or the three rather, which is life, body, and truth, all of which are constitutive of organization. Now, on the first question of life, it seems to me that between two philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Alain Badiou, there is a very, very close alliance insofar as both of them are philosophers who affirm life, in the sense that they affirm life in something like the sense of a thought, that there's a thought of life. But the difference between them is the following, it seems to me, and we can take this up in discussion. In Gilles Deleuze, what you find is that life is a kind of articulation or assemblage, if you want to use his own word, a dispositif, between something like specification, which is quality, which is an assemblage of qualities, and organization, which is spatial, which is organization in terms of the parts of a particular unit of life, like a body. So in that sense, it's a kind of spatio-temporal dynamism, which Deleuze calls a method of dramatization, a spatio-temporal dynamism. But still, one of the sides of this dynamism is something like nature. To that extent, Deleuze is not someone who's a naturalist at all, but at the same time, he's not someone who is outside of nature or is a thinker to the outside of nature, insofar as that one of the names of that outside is history. So you could say Deleuze is talking of life at the level of something like natural historical discourse. Now, it is at this level that Badiou, in his chapter "What It Is to Live," at the conclusion of Logics of Words, poses a question with a different kind of tonality, when he says that the question of life actually is not a question of either nature or dynamism or spatio-temporal dynamism at all, but life is something which is the question of creativity. Life is something which is new. Now, what is interesting is when you go back to Deleuze on this, then you find that the new is exactly what in Deleuze, and there's a whole genealogy of this in Deleuze, particularly Antonin Artaud's theater is an example of that, where again and again what you find in Artaud and Deleuze is a certain repulsion of life as it is localized in the organic body, or in the body which is an organization of organs. So that is why we hear Artaud say that I'm seeing a body in the theater which is a completely new body. But of course, one realizes why Artaud says it, because as a human being with organs, all his life, his organs made his life hell before he actually died of a failure of organs. So in that sense, he hated organs. Deleuze takes that up exactly as someone who, again, produces a thought of a body without organs. But the difference is, Deleuze is not a person or a thinker against organization. So in that sense, he articulates the very proposal of new body with an older proposal of organization, life as organization. So it seems to me in Deleuze, there's a negotiation between something which is the idea of a body, a new body, and at the same time, a certain kind of infinity of life, as it has been, mentioned in this particular the title of this conference. But this infinity is also an infinity of scalar organizations from macro to micro. So in that sense, it is still part of a certain discourse on nature. But the discourse on body is very close to what Badiou calls the discourse of truth, which is new, which is the challenge of the new. And this is where it seems to me that the comparison between history and the body, history in Badiou as the site of the new, and body in Deleuze as a site of something which could be called a certain kind of techno-cosmic new, a kind of a technical invention, a certain notion that you find in Deleuze again and again, which is the notion of the body which is entirely localized in the new affect, not the which is concentrated in the new affect, not the affects which we already know, but an affect which no one has ever felt before, which can only correspond to a new body. So in that sense, it is logical that in today's world, there is a certain kind of exuberance with Deleuzeism, because the new affects correspond to new bodies, which could sometimes be, seen in digital bodies, in non-human bodies, in bodies which are entirely separated from the known regime of human affects. So in that sense, there is a kind of question of the non-human, but that is exactly the level at which Badiou's truth arises. Truth as the name of the non-human in the human. And that is also where the greatest separation between Badiou and Deleuze arises in terms of politics. So that is my last point. That on the one hand, the two meet on the question of the non-human, but the two separate at that very moment with a certain violence with regard to the implications of the non-human for politics. It seems to me that it is a wrong impression that Badiou's politics is Deleuze's politics is anti-organizational and Badiou's is organizational. It seems to me both are interested in a certain response to politics in terms of the thought of organization. But these are not the same organizations at all. And it is on this point that I'd like to simply come back to the title of my presentation. Actually, there's a little omission in the title as it is printed. My title was Badiou and Deleuze, Comparative Note on Badiou and Deleuze, among others. And that among others has been omitted. And I'm not complaining. It is interesting that it has been omitted. But it is a question of among others, always among others for Deleuze. That this organization that he is thinking of is an organization which is always referred to, which is always, there are some voices. I'm just finishing. These organizations are always referred to to other bodies, to other voices, to other philosophies, to other philosophical outsides. So in that sense, it is.
Professor Chaudhry, your mic is off. I'm ever so sorry to inform you that. Could you put it on again, possibly?
I don't know when it went off. All right, the mic off is a good signal for me to actually finish. So that's the last point. That in Deleuze, the question of organization is an organization to come in the sense of a new organization, the new body as an example of new organizing. The trouble is, in a certain kind of vulgar Deleuzeism, a kind of a vulgar capitalized, Deleuze has capitalized, this exactly corresponds to a certain exuberance with new bodies, as in digital bodies, as in new morphologies, as in new money, as in new capitalism, and capitalism as the new example of multiplicity, which is a complete, well, it is distressing to speak like this when you speak of Deleuze in today's world. You know, and yet it is symptomatic of the thought of Deleuze as a thought of organization and not anti-organization. And it is on this question that Badiou's so-called communist thought on organization comes back with a certain pertinence as a relatively simpler, a relatively more classical question of history and organization as a thought of history, but also a history which makes it possible to think of the emergence of, the birth of the non-human. Again, the non-human, but the non-human as something which is part of human history. This is the challenge.
Professor Chaudhry, could you possibly...
And this is what brings us to the last correlation with the among others, which I want to emphasize, always among others. This is exactly which is the thought which Marx brought out in one of his texts from 1844, 1845, which is the thought of generic humanity. Generic humanity is the thought of the non-human as the possibility of human history. So with that, I thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you so much for that, Professor Chaudhry. And as you finish with Marx and the question of species being, that perhaps we can bring that up in the Q&A. And I love the way that you kind of thought about organization and disorganization, and treated perhaps like Badiou as a philosopher of organization, and Deleuze perhaps even with a kind of anarchist kind of dimension to his philosophy as a question of disorganization, which is one way to lead on to the next speaker. In some way, it seems to go very well with Andrew Culp, who is probably one of the most, I would say, one of the most famous political philosophers writing on Deleuze today. And Andrew Culp has a particular reading of Deleuze, which might well go against Professor Chaudhry's kind of threefold understanding of what affirmation is. So it would be nice to see how that comes out. Just to give a quick bio reading of Andrew. Andrew teaches in California at Cal Arts on media history and theory, and in the postgraduate and the graduate school rather on the MA program on aesthetics and politics. And he has numerous journal articles covering media, film, politics, and philosophy in very prestigious journals like Radical Philosophy and Angelicae and Boundary and so on. But probably he's most famous for his book, Dark Deleuze, which is only a few years old, really, which has already been translated into numerous languages. And he has a very, in Asia, he has a very kind of, and indeed India, he has a very kind of big following, really. And he has his book really put the politics back into Deleuze studies in his very unique reading of Deleuze's philosophy. And perhaps I can, without further ado, pass on to Andrew.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank my fellow panelists, the organizers, for putting together such an amazing event with just such an impressive lineup of thinkers and new ideas. And then also just everyone for taking the time to be here today to have our conversation, which I hope really develops. And I can't think of a better talk to segue into my own, discussing the idea of the new, because I'm a very avid reader of Francois Zurabitch-Ville's reading of Deleuze, in which he poses Deleuze as a thinker of the event and a radical event in which the future and the event, through its non-resemblance to the present, is an undoing and subverting the ground of the present in this sort of very post-anti-Kantian sort of way. Though what I'm going to be talking about today, as was alluded to, will be maybe a more philosophical, a more political take, and also maybe employ a method that would come from someone like Laguerre on non-philosophy, which is to say, use philosophy as a sort of raw material for addressing non-philosophical problems. So how to import the elements of philosophy outside of its own field to see what work it can be done. And in particular, I'm interested today in the question of communism and maybe the limits or ends of communism or a reimagination of it. What's great is for the panel, I think you'll also see my collector's impulse that comes from a media scholar coming out. Whereas my use of media here will not so much be a inquiry into medium, though it's something I'm quite partial to. But here it will be to move between texts and understand the power of the texts and the words and the mediums and the context through which they were developed, which means a sort of attention to documents simultaneously with the sort of techno-social understanding of what the work of words and texts and documents have done, both in their moment, but also as they get reimagined in this sort of way of both A Thousand Plateaus or even What is Philosophy. And also to indulge my political fascination of this particular connection between DNG and communism, because I have a forthcoming book that will be out in a few months with Minnesota Press. It's called A Guerrilla Guide to Refusal. And in some ways, it's a much more practical or document or concrete book, but it also really tries to live up to the Nietzschean idea to be an untimely intervention, if one can paradoxically say an untimely intervention in the present. And I had a challenge today trying to decide if I would speak about this or some of my ongoing work on cybernetics, because I have another project that I've been working, and it I feel a little bad that we didn't get to talk about the cybernetics, because I think that would be another really interesting connection, especially with the first couple panelists. But I'll put that aside for now. So to sort of open, I want to begin actually with some words from Mustafa Kayati, who was a member of the Situationist International in the 60s. He was the author of The Poverty of Student Life, which famously was involved in the events of May 68. And he writes a piece for the Situationist International Journal number 10 called Captive Words, Preface to a Situationist Dictionary. Of course, a dictionary that was never made, but his sort of words on what a dictionary could or should be. And taking a few words from it, I would say, on this question of communism, of course. He says, every revolutionary theory has to invent its own terms. It is impossible to get rid of a world without getting rid of a language that conceals and protects it. Words forged by revolutionary criticism are like partisans' weapons. Abandoned on the battlefield, they fall into the hands of the counter-revolution. And like prisoners of war, they are subjected to forced labor. Concepts of radical critique suffer the same fate as the proletariat. They are deprived of their history, cut off from their roots. To deny ourselves the use of a word is to deny ourselves a weapon used by our adversaries. What's interesting is actually, this is coming out of I can't see it, a somewhat recent collection, including the work of Bruna Asterian, but also Gilles Dauvet, who works in the tradition of communization. And he uses it to do a bit of a survey or an assessment of the fortunes of communism, in which he says that communism was put to what he calls forced labor by the Soviets, and then we would imagine the Chinese, in a way that totally makes it a dead term, concept that may not even be worth saving. He then looks to suspicion of the word as it comes through the Communist Party USA, or how communism or socialism in many other contexts even gets associated with the Gulag or some of the worst moments of the 20th century. And so he asks, can we have a communism without even communism? And that's maybe where I see DNG sort of coming in for me. So I'll move to some other words. These are actually from an interview that was published in the French collection Negotiations, that was short texts and interviews with Deleuze. And he does an amazing interview with Negri. Oh, in fact, before I do this, maybe I'll make one other entry. In The German Ideology, it's itself a sort of odd text that was only published in fragments initially and was late to be translated. Marx and Engels famously argue that, quote, communism for us is not a state of affairs to be established, but an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. This itself mirroring many of the words and moves of what a philosophy. Furthermore,
could you please turn your mic off, whoever is on?
They continue in The German Ideology by saying, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. This is precisely, I think, where DNG pick it up once again to create a philosophy of movement that we've seen not only in and through 1,000 Plateaus and What is Philosophy, but ultimately reworked by so many other people. I'm thinking the work of David Lapajade, Thomas Nail, and just like so many others who are taking the sense of movement and seeing where it goes. So let me turn to that interview with Negri, in which Negri asks him about 1,000 Plateaus, which to some people is taken as a less political text than Anti-Oedipus, or even a non-political text in some ways. Though for me, I think the nomadology is really the heart of the text, and so it should be taken as political. But Deleuze responds to a question and says, I think Felix Guattari and I have remained Marxists in our different ways, perhaps, but both of us. You see, we think that any political philosophy must turn on the analysis of capitalism and the ways it has developed. What we find most interesting in Marx is his analysis of capitalism as an immanent system that is constantly overcoming its own limitations, and then coming up against them once again in a broader form, because its fundamental limit is capital itself. In that way, Deleuze then says, 1,000 Plateaus sets out in many different directions, but there are at least three main ones. First, we think society is defined not so much by contradictions as by lines of flight. It flees all over the place, and it's very interesting to follow those lines of flight taking shape at any particular moment or other. And then he goes in and he talks about Europe a little bit, and then he says, actually, Europe is completely put to shame because everything interesting is actually going on in the East. Then he says, the second main theme of 1,000 Plateaus, this other direction, is minorities rather than classes. So already a deformation away from a certain orthodox Marxism. And then finally, the third direction, which amounts to finding a characterization of war machines that's nothing to do with war, but to do with a particular way of occupying, taking up space-time or inventing new space-times, revolutionary moments, but then in parentheses, he still mentions the PLO. So there's still deeply political organizations with a relation to other things, but also artistic movements, war machines in this sense. So we get this notion that Marxism is still really at the core. And so moving to my forthcoming book, I want to read a brief section from it that establishes a term that I try and rehabilitate, but maybe not too strongly, this notion of communism. And it's what I call subtractive communism. And it comes from some previous work that I do in the introduction to the text, where I locate the n-1 that is in the rhizome plateau as well as throughout 1,000 Plateaus. Whereas many will interpret Deleuze and the production of the new as perhaps a n+1, which would be an adding of dimensions or a spidering out of multiplicities into a web of the new. In fact, the new also comes with a subtraction, an elimination, a removal of dimensions in order to create new ones. It's a sort of dynamic movement that I had mentioned previously. So I work through this, and then I also go to Michel Foucault's sort of middle period works in which he talks about war as an analytic. I'm not going to read those portions, but that's just sort of the context. And I'm sort of criticizing many forms of socialism and state communism that have come before. So then I come to my sort of proposal here. There's an end to the long journey through war as an analytic, what I propose as, quote, subtractive communism. It does not blueprint an ideal society, which has gotten many state communists only as far as authoritarian socialism. It instead casts its lot with the ungovernable. Its subtractive operations are the negation of cybernetic governance through a growth of the underground. Its underground is a world made up of sex workers, convicts, and outcasts, as seen through the eyes of Jean Genet, the journal Der Eingene, Lucia Sanchez Serranil, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Guy Okenyam, Francoise Daubon, Mario Miele, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Linda Evans. Any communism worth its name aligns with them, as even Huey P. Newton came to see in 1970 when he pondered his famous letter, quote, maybe a homosexual can be the most revolutionary. Against the state politicians' fair weather use of war analysis, I look to T. Kuhn, which proposes a conceptual framework of, quote, diffuse guerrilla warfare. It begins with disseminating oneself in a multiplicity of foci, like many rifts in the capitalist whole. This shifts war from a defense of a collective subject, nation, or people to a struggle for separation or autonomy. This difference was amplified during Italy's tumultuous years of lead, when numerous armed militants imitated the state, while others spread creativity through a sort of guerrilla thinking without becoming guerrillas. These rifts were filled by radio stations, bands, celebration riots and squats that resisted not as occupations, but as empty architecture of indistinction, informality, and semi-secret that became anonymous, signed with fake names, using a different every time, and thus unattributable, soluble like the sea. These operations did not speak with the voice of a coherent subject, but rather Their frequency and intensity formed a consistency nonetheless, like so many marks etched in half-light, left as mere traces of authorship and thus constituting a multifaceted offensive more formidable than the hardened counterpoints in the armed ranks of the militant groups. The non-coherence of these seemingly autonomous elements therefore outlined a struggle which was not simply between revolutionary and conservative forces, but between ways of doing politics. On one side was a coherence of the Italian state, which was derived from popular Italian perceptions that authority of the state was genuine and effective, morally correct means for reasonable and fair use. And then the other, the ones proposed here, was a diffusion of fragmented appearances that formed a certain intensity in the circulation of bodies between all of its points. Talk about a few examples, but then I go through a series of slogans, which are maybe the more fun part. So let me just read a series of slogans that I think sort of promote the perspective that I'm proposing here. So I'm thinking of turn of the century classical anarchists who had slogans like free the class war prisoners, that which is maintained with blood and fire, through blood and fire shall remain. We are at war, but it isn't a war against a nation. It's a never-ending war against our own country, where everything that is beautiful and great is achieved by the dangerous march of humanity and always against God, masters, and government. Or maybe the new left, such as art is dead, burn the museums, baby, or bring the war home, be a marginal, be a hero, or the Indian wars are not over, or even newer strands like act up, fight back, no justice, no peace. They only call it class war when we fight back. The Fourth World War, be great, be gay, do crime, Stonewall was a riot, and more. So let me get to the philosophical bits here. Thousand Plateaus for me is a guerrilla manual to a non-fascist life, sort of doing a turn on the famous Foucault preface to Anti-Oedipus. Thousand Plateaus serves as a philosophical manual for irregular war without becoming an armed militant, a sort of what I call guerrilla without guerrillas. Philosophers make poor combatants. That's because, quote, in the struggle for legitimacy, the best we can make is no claim on authority. I'm taking this directly from Deleuze in his introduction to his intro remarks and negotiations. This is not to say that philosophy is useless. D.H. Lawrence, who shows up in A Thousand Plateaus, for instance, found his ally situation, quote, so weak physically that it could not let the metaphysical weapons rust unused. Deleuze finds himself in a similar situation when explaining the title of negotiations, why he chose it. In the face of things with true power, which he notes are religion, states, capitalism, science, law, public opinion, television, philosophy is not provisioned well enough to battle them head on. But neither can philosophy engage them in civil discourse because, quote, it cannot converse with them. It has nothing to tell them and nothing to communicate, which is a theme that you see in so much of late period Deleuze, in which he's sort of rallying against the new philosophers and others who seem to be taking to the talk shows. And these days we would imagine TikTok or social media. All that philosophy can do is wage, quote, a guerrilla campaign against them, in which the negotiations of words are wielded like weapons between hostile parties. I talk about counterinsurgency a little bit because I think it's a very clear articulation of where earlier modes of thinking that came out of communication and communication studies and cybernetics were then utilized in this very material force. I'll save you that for now, but I'll go on and mention sort of 4 terms that come from the avant-garde that I think describe the high modernism of Deleuze and the sort of political approach. And there are 5 nons: a non-communication, which is a special affinity to the destructive gesture of the anarchist, like a propaganda of the deed as an alternative to the propaganda by the word. A nonsense, which is a resistance to representation via absurdity or abstraction, and a negation or emptying out of meaning. Third, a non-utility, which is a contempt for conceptions of art that use or have a purpose outside of itself. And so it rejects in favor of an aesthetic autonomy. So kind of the old debate on art for art's sake, but reutilized within an avant-garde political framework. A non-collectivity, which is a basic credo of aesthetic individualism, inspired a bit by Max Stirner, and egoism, which is not to say anti-political or liberal or libertarian, but a notion that can't be found in a force like the people. And a non-popularity, which is a repudiation of the popular and things that are said to be accessible as hopelessly bourgeois or corrupt. So I only have a brief time left, so I want to hop to a few more documents just to sort of find precisely where I want to locate myself. The first is returning to Negri once again as a key interlocutor in this conversation, and the lectures that he gave while on the run, living in France. Most of you probably know this, but he was living under the name Tony Guattari for a bit and living in some of Guattari's apartments. And he was invited to the Collège de France by Althusser to give a series of lectures that were then published called Marx Beyond Marx. And he has a whole chapter toward the end, or lecture toward the end, called Communism and Transition, where he's trying to sort of find his way. And he says, quote, "As we have seen, communism is in no case a product of capitalist development. It's its radical inversion, which makes communism neither a teleology of the capitalist system, nor its catastrophe. It is a new subject which takes form, which transforms reality and destroys capital." So already the sense of the new that we just talked about previously. And he goes on to say, when the conditions and the objective of the abolition of work do not exist, planning is the only new mode of capitalist command, and that is called socialism. It is here that the Marxist critique of socialism exerts all of its force. Socialism is not, and can in no case be, a stage or a passage toward communism. Socialism is the highest form, superior form of the economic rationality of capital, of the rationality of profit. It still thrives on the law of value. It carries to a degree the centralization of the general synthesis, which connects the form of socialist planning, economic management, to the functions of the political and judicial machinery of the state. Socialism keeps alive and generalizes the law of value. The abolition of work is the inverse, the mark of that law of value. So then, how would we get to this? In no way to affirm Marx as somehow having the final answer, but it's worth looking at two texts very briefly, sort of having a sort of starting point for where I would go with this. First is in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels say, quote, "The theory of the communists can be summed up in a single sentence: supersession of private property." Of course, this is an Hegelian framework that we would maybe want to problematize through the precise way that Deleuze and Negri talked about in that interview, not about contradictions, but somehow lines of flight. And then in the 1844 manuscripts, there's a famous section on private property in which Marx specifies three different approaches to private property, or an opposition to property. And the first, he looks at a crude communism, in which the form of appearance of private property is set away, and it's only affirmed in terms of community, which of course I'm sure we see everywhere today. At least I can't go to a single institution that doesn't say we're a community, community values, community this, community that. So he's already saying that this is the most vulgar form of this attempt to abolish private property. The second is a communism that, whether democratic or despotic, still is incomplete. It still has a largely administrative approach. This, I think, like we saw through Negri, is often connected to a socialism that simply just tries to collectivize it in a way that doesn't philosophically or metaphysically get beyond private property, which is perhaps what I would argue here is the goal. And then this third version, quote, "Communism as the positive supersession of private property as human self-estrangement, hence the actual appropriation of the human essence by and for humankind," which is to say, sort of species being, as we might take it previously. And so my final provocation might be, after Althusser, after sort of anti-humanism or what have you, and with DNG, if we're to reimagine a philosophical approach to communism, how might we return again to that notion of species being and find a new version of it? And perhaps it's already answered with micromedia, with confronting all the material waste as well as the labor exploitation and the years of settler colonialism that have been embedded in the dead labor that we see. Or perhaps it's an invention of the new and a creative impulse that actually imagines an old world and destroys the same. In many ways, my new book uses many of these as a starting point, and I look forward to our conversation, hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and all of the speakers today. And we have been given some time extra for Q&A, so I'm sure people have their, have questions. There are some already in the chat, but I thought I'd abuse my privilege a little bit and ask a few questions, if it's okay. And I was wondering, I'll start with Laura, I think, and because it connects with Professor Chowdhury's mention of the pandemic as a kind of world skin. So I was curious about the idea of the skin, or you called it the membrane, when you were discussing the idea of kind of ensouled matter. So I was wondering about this, whether you're, what is it, your project? Are you writing a kind of planetary theosophy? Is that your idea? I mean, the idea of you suggesting these brilliant, salubrious assemblages and the soul assemblages, things like that. So I was wondering, okay, so that's a question of healthy or unhealthy assemblages. Okay, fine. So then I was wondering, are you writing an ecosophy as a consequence? Is that your idea? This idea of like a salubrious and soul assemblages of matter, is that a pharmacology of media? Because then you could turn to someone like Bernard Stiegler to understand that. But then Radek and yourself were talking about a cosmology. So are you looking for a new kind of cosmology to that? So I got all of that. I was wondering, which one are you edging towards? And then, of course, when we have the idea of the skin or the membrane, we have the idea of Teilhard de Chardin's skin of the earth, okay, which is an idea of the life becoming conscious of itself, right? Higher stage of consciousness and stuff like that. And then I guess you was going to say this ensouled matter, that the earth could be treated as ensouled matter. So that it would mean that you are writing a theosophy of sorts. But of course, Deleuze would have a problem with the idea of the omega point in Teilhard. So the idea that the life becoming conscious of itself, someone like Vernadsky or Teilhard de Chardin, Deleuze has a problem about these higher stages of consciousness and things like that. So the omega point is not there in Deleuze's work. Anyway, so could you have a go at that question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joff. What a provocative menu of options. Well, the subtitle of my book is that some of this was taken from is From Your Body to the Cosmos. So it is a cosmology in which I emphasize the link from microcosm to macrocosm, and the from your body is actually meant to kind of resonate with the language of self-help books. So it is sort of a personal philosophy on how to make connections to the cosmos and how to participate in soul assemblages. No, I don't connect having a soul to consciousness. It's quite a different question. I connect having a soul to having life, and as you heard, I broaden the concept of what can be alive, and also you heard that I do I begin with the idea that what is alive is what is surrounded by a skin, but I critique that the way it's coming from Hofmeier's biosemiotics, and instead say what creates a provisional skin is being held together by a process. So that is how an assemblage can be thought of, to have a collective soul. Yeah, that's pretty much my answer to your great question. Thank you.
That's excellent. So I'm going to ask another question before we look at the chat, because otherwise I start to press all the buttons. And this question is for Professor Chowdhury. And you gave 3 kinds of affirmation, okay? And I got fascinated by your idea of the affirmation of affirmation, as it were, and the affirmation of a lover's affirmation. It's a totally fantastic idea. And the idea that somehow the philosophy is the thinker of affirmation, okay, right? The lover of wisdom must be the kind of thinker of affirmation. And then you gave your kind of, the idea of a limit, and then a kind of theological understanding, and then thinking about philosophy in the middle of things. And that's absolutely fine. But one thing, I mean, when we're talking about Deleuze, when we talk about affirmation, then we have to think about Nietzsche. And I was wondering why, because you talk about Freud and the unconscious, things like that, I was wondering, like, why would Nietzsche not be part of that? And if Nietzsche is part of that, then we understand the unconscious and the will to power and things like that. And then we would need another dimension to your trilogy, would be about pertaining to the future as such, because that would mean an affirmation of the perspectivism in Nietzsche's idea. That would be, again, you're thinking about what we talk about, new effects, a new body and a new earth, and okay, the new future. And then that would be the idea of the exuberance you kind of pointed to in Deleuze. I think one thing that would be missing would be the Nietzschean aspect to that, because that would mean affirmation of knowledge as the perspectivism of the affirmation of knowledge. And what is that? That is the affirmation of the earth as it is, the eternal return. And then, right, okay, so do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. One reason why Nietzsche didn't feature in my presentation, sheer the contingency of the brief time that I spent. I mean, surely if I were to go on, Nietzsche would come in a big way. But it's very important to look at Nietzsche, because yes, Nietzsche is actually someone who in a way breaks through this classification, because what Nietzsche does is to make this double affirmation, in a sense, a single affirmation, and the affirmation of the affirmation itself as something which is the pure act of the will to the affirmation as a kind of will, affirmation itself as a kind of new body, So in Nietzsche, particularly the last part of Nietzsche, what is fascinating and also very challenging is to think of affirmation as something which is in the act of affirmation, which is the creation of something like a new body, which Deleuze, in logic of sense, actually also he articulated with the Stoics, because then to say that I am Dionysus, or I am Christ, is why I am a destiny. Each of them are in Stoic language enunciations with incorporeal transformations, where there is a kind of becoming not Dionysus, but becoming the affirmation of Dionysus. So in that sense, the challenge is really to live on the very edges of what such an enunciation does to your body, which in the case of Nietzsche at that time in Ex Homo is something like the body of a mad person, or a kind of body which is a delusional body. So that is absolutely the limits of any thought on organization. You're right. It really marks the point to which even any sort of organization dare not go. And in that sense, he's indeed what Deleuze would call Nietzsche in philosophy is a kind of singular point, a remarkable point. What is interesting with Nietzsche, when you read Badiou's seminar on Nietzsche, one of his seminar courses that he did on Nietzsche, is that Badiou does not. I mean, this is something which is also parallel to Badiou's reading of psychoanalysis. Badiou actually does not put that kind of emphasis on the last part of Nietzsche. Badiou really takes Nietzsche at the level of how he responded to historical events, recognizable historical events. For instance, the French Revolution. So in that sense, there is always the question, if you speak of Nietzsche, as both Nietzsche as someone who's at the, and this of course is also, and since I mentioned Artaud, is also a question of what Deleuze calls the dark precursors, which are without figure, which are still underneath, or which are undifferentiated, and yet they differentiate. So in that sense, Artaud and Nietzsche mark that kind of a threshold of something which is beneath the earth. In Badiou's seminar on Nietzsche, he actually brought out the specific historical moments in Nietzsche's own response to events outside. So the outside in Nietzsche again comes back, whether it be big events like the French Revolution or what in Nietzsche is the marketplace. When he speaks of people, Nietzsche speaks of people, the outside of Nietzsche, and his response to the marketplace of people who he wants to affirm, or though Badiou doesn't speak of it, Nietzsche's response to the theater, when Nietzsche says that I would rather be the Hans Wurst of theater than be a Catholic priest. Hans Wurst being the most reviled and degraded figure of comic theater. So Nietzsche as a kind of comic Dionysus, grotesque Dionysus. So I think that is really something which is a very important horizon of thinking about affirmation, where indeed affirmation seems to defy much of organizational thought, even if that organizational thought be the thought of, like I said, through Badiou, be the thought of disorientation in history. So that would be my brief response to you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I was thinking about, as you mentioned, the French Revolution and Nietzsche responding to historical events. Well, what the historical event Nietzsche principally would respond to is the crisis of religion, of Christianity. Yes. And what that is one reading, which is very unfashionable now. I mean, one of the popular readings of Nietzsche is some kind of, I don't know, some kind of like affirmation of a popular culture or something. Like, no, he's responding to the deep-seated crisis in religion, religion in European religion. And then, and so there is that. Anyway, I
correct. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
I shall perhaps open up the chat and stop stealing the questions. And there are many, so I'm not quite sure how to respond to them. Maybe yeah, I'm actually not quite sure to do this. Okay. If we look to Babu's question, I'm going to read it. It's to Professor Chowdhury. He says, you have rightly referred to the ambiguous affirmation in Immanuel Kant, whose philosophy is known for its epistemological restriction. Wasn't such, this is the question, I think, wasn't such an ambiguous affirmation a potential of sorts, like one presumably can find in the ambiguity of an aporia, that somehow, obviously aporia is without path, but this without path paved the way to a philosophical confirmation. Not quite sure what that means, but in the post-Kantian era. Philosophical affirmation. Thank you very much, Babu, for that. Could you perhaps respond to that question?
Yes, no, I'd love to. Could you? I'm so sorry. Could you read it just once more? Just take 2 minutes.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a complicated question. Yes. Yeah.
Let me. It says. Talking about Kant and the affirmation of the limit in your excellent presentation.
Correct. I get that, yes.
And then the epistemological limit, okay, so the limit of knowledge as such.
Yes.
And then Babu's question, if I can, sorry, first name is quite rude, okay. Question is there this ambiguous affirmation there? Is it a potential, like, for example, the ambiguity of an aporia? So then, and the post-Kantian era would be a philosophical affirmation of that aporia.
All right. Let me try. This is a very interesting, complicated thought. For one thing, aporia is indeed an impasse, which is a particular threshold through which you cannot pass, at least not in that conjuncture. In Kant, there is, well, aporia is a stronger word, but yes, there's ambiguity. Ambiguity is really a particular kind of calculable matrix of possible paths to take, if not a true total aporia, but there is a certain undecidability with regard to those paths. So history of philosophy doesn't close with Kant, surely not. It does open up in a revolutionary way, but at the same time, you're right. The different paths that philosophy must take now are not decidable in a very simple philosophical history, post-Kantian. So yes, to that extent, you're completely right. Post-Kantian philosophy is a kind of living out of that undecidability. And within post-Kantian philosophy, there are so many different philosophical lineages and different philosophical futures that come out of it, that ambiguity or that undecidability actually makes possible the entire modern history of philosophy. So that only testifies to the richness of that Kantian moment. Jean-Luc Nancy, in a conversation with Ali-Badi, pointed out that ambiguity is also something which is within, internal to Kant's thought, not just philosophically, but also in terms of his relationship to his age, politically, culturally, existentially. So one of the great stories about Kant is that Kant, who would not affirm anything, really, insofar as affirmation is a kind of what? Affirmation is always a certain modification of the affect. Affirmation is nothing if not an affirmation of one's body. Insofar as the body is modified, the body is defamiliarized. Kant's body was never defamiliarized except once, which was when he heard about the French Revolution, when he changed his schedule for his walk, his daily walk. His body actually went through a new affect, such that he actually changed the routine of his walk, which absolutely was clockwork walk that he did every day, day after day. Well, Nancy points this out, and this is not a minor anecdotal matter. It actually shows the philosopher, like I again and again say, among others, despite everything. So in that sense, there is an ambiguity, but there's also literally a path, because he does make the walk longer when he goes to buy a newspaper, I think, that day, hearing of what's going on in France. So, ambiguity, aporia is one version of this, but I think ambiguity, I would like to retain ambiguity and its possible undecidability, out of which there are so many philosophical decisions. Yes.
Well, I'm going to let Manoj ask a question in a moment, okay? Because it will to you, Professor Chaudhry, again. But I'm just going to ask a question to Andrew, so we have at least everybody gets a response, gets a chance to respond. But I was struck by the end of your discussion when you were talking about the early Marx and Gattungswesen, the species being questioned, because Professor Chaudhry kind of picked up on that as well, right? Marx writing in the 1940s. And I was struck with your argument regarding like subtraction and a communism without communism. But then if you look to the early Marx for a new kind of inspiration, then don't you run the risk of falling into the old language of, as you mentioned, Enthouserung or the estrangement or alienation? And that raises the question of the essence, right? I mean, that would be a kind of troubling from a certain reading of Deleuze. And the idea, of course, in species being, in Gattungswesen, is the return of man to man, that is domination, the abolition of domination in the future communist society. So in your reading of that part of Marx, then my question would be, the book that Deleuze was planning to write at the end of his life was on the magnificence of Marx. So what kind of book would that be?
Such a great question. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, especially the so-called young Marx, is so full of both a Hegelian but also a humanist spirit, which are things that just metaphysically don't come together with DNG or just Deleuze in particular very well. I mean, maybe that's one reason that the book was never written, is that sort of Deleuze was, you know, challenged this idea and just like forever deferred it and put it off. There's this funny game that people play where they say, well, you know, here I'm writing the unfinished book, which is also like a really fun media exercise, right? Where you get to sort of have this sort of never written manuscript, but you have the title. And so then everyone gets to play the game of like, how would I write the thing? You know, I'm not sure I'm up to the task. I think there might be other Deleuzians up to the task. I'm not sure I'm up to the task of exactly writing the grandeur of Marx. It might be about movement. You know, that's where some people have gone with it. I think that's a little too process oriented for me. We had the Hart and Negri move, where it was, okay, so it's not about, you know, human spirit and humans reconnecting. It's about something like really deep and material, maybe not exactly the earth, but it's something about the commons, you know, a previous mode of production, but also a form of relation, and also something that could be very material. I'd be just excited to hear how other people would write the book too, you know. I will say that the book that I write goes in this other direction, which is the partisan. So it's to say that, and maybe it takes this Nietzschean route that you all were talking about earlier too, where it's about a perspective. And that perspective, for at least this book that I'm thinking right now, is about agitation and particular groups of people, beginning with the minority, beginning with others. And so then it doesn't ask what is sometimes taken to be this majoritarian question of like, what is the perfect, you know, world communism or something, which I think gets people into hot water pretty quickly too, because it can easily become authoritarian, can easily lead to forms of biopolitics that are really, really kind of scary and that have always targeted minorities and hurt them. So maybe I'm failing here, but it might be a bit of a letdown, but I'd love to hear what other people think.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. And Manoj, you're going to ask a question now. And then after Manoj's a brief question and response, there is a question for Radek on the question of recursivity and its connection with Yukfi's work. And perhaps we can hear about the, I forgot how to say it, it's the cosmotechnical phylum. So we can hear about the technological lineage you were referring to. So Manoj, your question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Shomo, for the wonderful presentation. I'm just I have a question for you. It's just puzzled by the category of affirmation. Like, I'm really afraid whether affirmation, isn't it sort of an empty category also? Like in the sense that if I commit suicide, it's like it's an affirmation, right? Which ironically is beyond my knowledge. And it's also beyond my experience also, right? So what is the body? What is body in that suicide after you make the affirmation of taking your soul? There is no new body, right? You make an affirmation here in a technical sense. And also sort of what is the effect in a suicide? Like, which in a sense is affirmation in the absolute sense. And what new body emerged there, right? So another way, it's like state would say that it's a negation of law, right? It won't accept it as an affirmation. And in terms of negation, it's like Spinoza also says negation is determination, which Hegel takes up, or negation is affirmation in that sense. So isn't it like there is some sort of an ambiguity in the concept of affirmation? So a philosophical. I'm just being curious what your response would be on that.
Yes. No, you're right. That's the reason why I needed to schematize and also unfold the idea of affirmation into several possibilities. And one of these possibilities, I didn't talk about it, but I have that in mind, is a kind of peculiar affirmative nihilism. So suicide would be an example of that. And there are different kinds of, even suicides are, so for instance, I mean, if you were to talk about the suicide bomber today in the context of the discourse on terrorism, then one of the ways of making the suicide bomber so-called affirmative nihilism is actually to find some sort of a discourse for it, which is, if you think about it, which is a kind of pedagogical or didactic discourse where through the act of committing suicide as part of a kind of suicide, the sort of collective destruction of oneself and others in suicide bombing, there's also a teaching that is attempted, which is that in the very act of doing this, I teach you to negate the world. The world is not worth living in. You know, so there is in this peculiar affirmative nihilism a certain didactic project, which of course is a perverse project and also fails miserably. No one is taught a thing. At the same time, it seems to me there is a didactic logic that by killing and dying, I teach you in this world, I teach you that the world is not worth living in. And that could, of course, be rationally explained by saying, oh, the world is a corrupt world, the world is a decadent world, the world is anti a particular anti, you know, any particular religion could be used, that it is infidel, whatever. Each of them is a rational perspective, but there is a kind of affirmative nihilism which depends on the nature of that suicide and everything that comes out of it as discourse. And suicides, I mean, after all, in recent Indian history, Rohit Vemula's suicide creates the conditions for a collective affirmation, which is an affirmation for the entire Dalit movement, you know. But from where does it come? It comes from something which is in the text, in the letter, which is the kind of immortal of the suicide. So there is a kind of immortal of the suicide as much as there is the failed teaching of the suicide, as in the case of the suicide bomber. But with Rohit Vemula, there is an efficacy of that suicide in the immortality of his words, which actually becomes the body, or in my words, the subjective organization of the Dalit movement. And that, of course, has its own history and so on. We don't have to go into that. So, you know, it's a complicated question. It's a very good question. That is one concrete answer. Now, as such, in terms of affirmation, now that's the reason I cited the Ariel Dorfman story. The affirmation that I'm interested in is always an affirmation in relation to something which is a historicity, which is a materiality, which is outside, the materiality of the outside. So the lovers are always a real outside to the sort of saturated totality, which is that could be the totality of religion, could be the totality of caste, could be the totality of a particular patriarchy, whatever. So something happens, which is love, and it creates a particular outside, which then produces a certain kind of challenge, a threshold, where a decision has to be taken. You know, so Dorfman says that the lovers affirm not with a sense of affirmation in general, but they do it singularly, concretely, in their love. In that sense, they're indifferent to the world. They're indifferent to the laws of the world. So there is also in affirmation a certain indifference. You know, a certain, Deleuze used to beautifully call it a sterile splendor, a sterility, a splendid sterility. There is a kind of splendid sterility in affirmation, but the philosophical affirmation is not of the same order. So that's why it's an affirmation of that affirmation, which then has consequences. That would be, I mean, it's I think a fascinating discussion to have. But what I'm interested in, to repeat, is an affirmation, the third affirmation that I mentioned, which is the affirmation to a materiality, in relation to materiality, to historicity. In the middle, neither in the beginning nor at the end, but in the middle. Again, these are schematization. They shouldn't be taken literally. So yes, Manoj.
Well, that's absolutely beautiful description you just gave. Absolutely fantastic. Manoj, do we have time for one more question? Is that
yeah, we will take one more question and sort of wind up the discussion. Yeah.
Well, I think this is from Roshni. So, Radhik, do you have any thoughts about the question of recursivity and how that works with your video project? And if you have time, how about the chaos mode technical phylum? How does that work with recursivity?
Yeah, thanks so much, Geoff. It's kind of really interesting because, of course, the question of cosmotechnical phylum feeds into the question of recursivity. So they both come together. Now, okay, recursivity is specified in Yuk Hui's book from 2019. And it was also recently kind of revised a bit as I understand it, there are two definitions that he gives of recursivity, and I can also talk how it relates to Kant. So basically, the first definition is it's a kind of non-mechanistic, and this is really important, this idea of non-mechanistic, non-linear operation which constantly returns to itself in order to know and determine itself. So this is something inspired by algorithms that we have in culture right now in the algorithmic society, obviously, and Hui's background is computer science. What's also really interesting, of course, for him, Kant is really important, and this notion, he finds this notion of recursivity going back to the Kant's third critique and the notion of reflective judgment, obviously. But, and of course, he says that Kant's, with this recursivity, opens up the organismic condition for philosophizing. But also there's a second definition that I really like. And this is a definition that tries to kind of model artificial intelligence in terms of Bergson. And this is a really interesting project. It was only this year in an article for this volume, Philosophy After Automation, that Hui proposed this type of direction. So now the second definition would be that recursion functions like a soul which comes back to itself in order to know itself, while in every moment of reaching out, it encounters contingencies. So so this is really interesting because it has a notion of the soul, and but also is talking about the notion of from the point of view of algorithms. So what I find really interesting in Hui is this, on the one hand, he comes from, you know, we can say cybernetics, philosophy of technology, but from the other hand, he also looks at, for example, Taoism, and formulates this notion of cosmotechnics also from the point of view of Taoism. Now, where I'm coming, what's my reason for applying those terms? Now, I think this is really interesting because right now I totally agree with Hui that each type of philosophizing should acknowledge this fact of planetarization of technology, and perhaps this is the new condition of philosophizing. And he formulates the question of contingency as the uncalculable. I think recently also Galloway, I think he has a kind of similar notion. So the incalculable, this is also something that is embodied by small files, small file movies, because working in compression aesthetics, for example, you're open to accidents and this type of limitation that you have, which the 5 megabytes, which you can interpret as this a kind of return actually of the same, is complicated because it's also bound up with contingency. So I'd say this festival and small file movies offer a way to invent new concepts. Those small files offer an opportunity to for the coming of being into concepts. So hence Laura's concept of soul assemblages. Now my own project has to do with on the one hand doing lots of research into Hui's ideas of cosmotechnics, but on the other hand trying to find resonances with the Deleuze-Guattarian idea of machinic phylum, which I think, as I discovered, is not that well researched. I made some strides towards giving, I suppose, more comprehensive analysis in a recent article in Deleuze-Guattari and the Art of Multiplicity book, when I'm unpacking, for example, this specific formulation in terms of early Iron Age Eurasian metallurgy that Deleuze and Guattari have. And this is something that it's not really research, it's a kind of something that is marginalized. And I think such perspective just ignore the amount of research that Deleuze and Guattari did into Grousset, Gryaznov, and all those other experts in the question of the nomadic and those Eurasian nomadism and metallurgy, and also Leroy-Gourhan. So yeah, it's an ongoing project. Right now, I'm also looking at the conceptualization of machinic phylum, since as it was first conceived in 1972 as a kind of afterthought of anti-Oedipus, and it's a kind of really interesting way to look at this coming into being of this concept, rather than this concept as already individuated, as as already published. So, for example, I'm also looking at the Deleuze seminars from the second part of 1970. So yeah, so this is an ongoing project, which also kind of resonates with the digital media, and it's a kind of circuit between philosophy, but it's philosophy that resonates with kind of the actual thing at hand. It's a kind of practical philosophy. So.
Well, I'm sure you could, it's absolutely fascinating what you said, and the idea of the machinic phylum and the autopoietic and allopoietic kind of aspects of that. And that somehow perhaps would, like, you'd be able to connect that with Yucri's work, right? And the idea of kind of the cybernetics and kind of autopoiesis and things like that. And somehow those things might go together, of course, with Bernard Stiegler's work and things like
exactly.
that. So,
I think, it can be subsumed into a kind of organology, but I think what is kind of really not well researched is the influence of Leroy-Gourhan on the notion of the machinic phylum, because people are looking at machinic phylum and they look at the seminars and they see, okay, this is idea of the metal thing is taken from Simondon when he's looking at this as a type of non-hylomorphic organization. But what is really not mentioned at all is Guattari's analysis of Leroy-Gourhan. and even before gesture and speech. So it's an analysis of milieu techniques, and which is kind of really, this is where the idea of technological lineage is taken.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, that idea of connecting Stiegler and Guattari up via Lower Guam, and you know, that I'm going to get into that when we speak in January, right, on our YouTube channel. Well, I think on that note, Manoj, is it you kind of intimating to me that we should probably wrap up now? Well, actually, I had fantastic. It was absolutely breathtaking, these talks, and they all seem to go together so perfectly well. And I'm anyway. I couldn't think of a better way to spend a Sunday afternoon than listen to these absolutely inspiring philosophical kind of meditations. So on that note, thank you very. All right, that's right. Yeah, sorry, being selfish. You know. Well, on that note, we should probably conclude then, Manoj. What's the next step? Do we just turn off our screens and go back to our lives, or?
No, you should stay back
right.
for the next sessions. Thank you, Professor Shomu. Thank you, Laura Marx Radek, and Professor Andrew Culp for your presentations, and thank you so much for being with us. And it was really a very good session. The discussion was really good. That is why I told Geoff to go ahead, even though we go running ahead of time. Like, you know, it's the last day. We should let the discussion happen. So that is why we extended the discussion also. And it was a brilliant session, both presentation wise and a good amount of discussion. It was really good. Thank you so much for all of you people who asked questions and who took part in the discussion and who presented. Again, Professor Shomu, Professor Andrew Culp, Laura Marx, Radek, thank you so much for joining with us and giving, being part of our discussion. And thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Geoff, for chairing the session. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Manoj. Thanks, Geoff. And Bobby, please, if Bobby can hear me. Thanks, Bobby.
And
Bobby should be there.
Geoff.
Yeah, I'm here like now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shomu, like for your wonderful talk, like now, as reading and learning also. Like, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, see you
one of
soon.
these days. Yeah.
Right.